Thank you, and thanks for staying after that very riveting speech by Mr. Zarif. We can promise you some more fireworks to follow in the next 1 hour or so. As we discuss the region from the Khyber to the Bosporus, this may sound like some, old world, old Silk Road, new Silk Road type of story, but actually it's the story of the new dynamics that are breaking out between Turkey, Iran, and the region between them. Without giving a big geography lesson, the fact is that from end to end, Turkey and Iran span the entire space or the breadth of what we call here in India West Asia, what the rest of the world refers to as the Middle East. But if you look at it, they actually form an arc over most of the countries of the region: Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and Muscat. But far from a chapeau, if you like, they are the bookends of the world's most difficult conflicts: the Arab-Persian divide, the Sunni-Shia divide, the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Yemen conflict, the blockade of Qatar, and of course the subject that's been discussed the most in the last day, I think, which is the conflict in Syria and where that is going. And I'm sure that that's going to be a large part of our discussion this evening as well. What I'd like to start with, because so much has happened just in the past week. I mean, if I was to discuss this region just a week ago, I might say it was going in a very different direction. But phone calls happen, visits happen. We have a very high-powered American delegation in this region today. And we have with us a panel that can easily encompass for us, bring us up to speed with what is happening given their points of view. I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by Sergey Ryabkov. Some of us heard him yesterday. He's the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. Manish Tewari, he's a lawyer, former Indian Minister of Information and Broadcasting in India, eminent politician from the Congress Party. Memduh, Karakullukçu, Vice Chairman and President, Global Relations Forum from Turkey, and Richard Fontaine, the President of the Center for a New American Security in the United States. Mr. Ryabkov, you're not actually in this region, but Russia's footprints and hand behind is spoken about always. Give us a sense of where you see the conflict going. In the last few days, we've seen a new axis, if you like, with Turkey, Russia, and Iran essentially saying, leave the region to us, or leave the current conflict to us. Can Russia really handle this? Is the US pullout from the region actually the kind of gift where you have to be careful what you wish for?
Thank you very much, Madam Haida. I am very honored to be at this panel together with so distinguished colleagues. Before I try to answer to your question, I'll kind of offer my perspective to this particular situation. Let me tell you and the audience that I have a prepared statement that covers somewhat different ground. It is called New Political Landscape in Eurasia. It is not boring. Rather, I would say it's quite, I would say, meaty in terms of assessments and even some conclusions on the Russian side. So I would ask organizers to put this into any files that would summarize the outcome of the fourth Raisina conference, which I believe is already a big success. But coming back to your question, it is not so that Russia and other so-called guarantor states now claim that the region, or for that case Syria in particular, should be left for efforts we undertake together with Iran and Turkey. What has been done insofar through Astana process was a supplement to the Geneva process. And only because of Geneva process driving forward slower than expected, and that sometimes also in a very idle, let us be frank, manner, then the three guarantor states presented a visionary alternative, first in form of actual arrangements for de-escalation, for establishment of firm and consistent ceasefire in many areas of the region, but also through participation in what was subsequently known as a Sochi process by the name of the Russian Black Sea city, where meetings of the People's Congress of Syria were held, and that culminated according to the roadmap, quote unquote, developed by the protagonists in, comprising the lists of persons that should finally enter into the Constitutional Committee. That is very essential to the whole political process. Now, we saw efforts of the so-called small group led by the US to defeat this process, to change the composition of the Constitutional Committee. It's very unfortunate because in the absence of this element of the whole construction, we will not have a full-fledged political process. Let's see what will happen further, especially after the coordinating powers under the UN realm turned from Staffan de Mistura to, now I don't remember, sorry, becoming old. First name I cannot remember. His family name is Perils, until recently the Norwegian ambassador to Beijing, China. We intend to work as closely as ever with him, and it should happen in concert. Everyone understands this. We impact as much as we can government in Damascus so that they perform accordingly. Things like return of refugees, like reconstruction should be looked into. We will continue our deconflicting dialogue with the US. We will share information and approaches to this with all relevant players, including with the European Union and individual European countries. We are very open there. There is no such thing like a hidden Russian agenda in Syria. I believe the same is with other guarantor states, although I know also that the role of Iran in this country is a very contentious one, but let's debate on this. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much. Richard Fontaine, if I could come to you. Of course, there is the Syria question. But in the last 1 year, just one calendar year, if you look at the swathe of US decisions from the sanctions on Iran, from the relationship with Saudi Arabia, from the general pulling out of a lot of spheres of conflict, and then finally these decisions we've seen in the last few days, which ended, interestingly, with a resounding sound of applause from Turkey, from Iran, from Russia, really, for Mr. Trump's announcement of a pullout. Where do you see the US in the Middle East? It has this huge presence there. Are we about to see that presence, if you like, of America in the Middle East now in decline?
The first thing I would say is that there is this general narrative that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, and one can understand why, particularly when President Trump made the decision on Syria and then, with Afghanistan to draw down half the troops and so forth. But we've heard this narrative going back into the Obama administration, and at one level it's understandable given events and so forth. At another level, it just doesn't comport with the facts. The United States still has its Air Force base in Incirlik. It still has today 2,000 troops in Syria and 14,000 in Afghanistan. It still has a base in Qatar. It still has a base in the United Arab Emirates. It still has a Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. And even if we draw down in Syria and at some point draw down in Afghanistan halfway or more, we're still going to have a very significant amount of representation and engagement and power projection capabilities in the region. On top of that, diplomatically, we're the one with the diplomatic relationships with many of these countries, whether it's Israel or Egypt and so forth. But there is something changing, and you can't deny the fact that given the decisions first under President Obama and then some of the recent decisions under President Trump, you are going to see a withdrawal of American forces, at least, in some of the places where they have mattered the most. So in Syria, obviously, is an example here. And, you know, the thing that I think the world is going to have to wrestle with is what actually fills the vacuums left behind by any American withdrawal in Syria, and then if at some point we withdraw from Afghanistan, rather than who attests that they would fill the vacuum. So, you know, President Erdogan has said, don't worry about ISIS from now on. It's down to 1%, and we've got it, so you guys can leave. You know, the Assad, Russia, Iran sort of alliance would love to say, okay, well, we can move up into that area. Well, ISIS is a threat to all of us, but it's not clear to me that ISIS is the #1 threat in President Erdogan's mind, as opposed to, say, an autonomous Kurdish zone on his border. And if that's the case, then does he go after one or another? Similarly, in Afghanistan, who would step into Afghanistan to, you know, it's the Taliban, it's not Russia, Iran, Turkey, anyone else. And so, you know, while we will, you know, there's this round of applause for the withdrawal announcements that you indicated. If we don't quite do this right, I suspect there may be a little bit in the region, despite the initial enthusiasm of, like the song from a decade ago, "You're gonna miss me when I'm gone," that, you know, people will actually miss the United States if we go. And if events don't turn out the way everyone would like, then if passes prologue, we'll be back.
But surely there's something in between those two, right? Absence of the US and immense intervention and presence of the US.
Yeah, so the question is what is politically and financially and in every other way sustainable? What's a sustainable presence? Actually, I think the presence in Syria did fit into that category. It's a relatively low cost, a relatively low number of troops, and the casualties were very low, and we were empowering local partners to do fighting against an enemy that certainly was an acute threat to the United States and its allies. The president obviously made a different decision, but that would have been my view. Afghanistan, I think, frankly, is much harder. It's $50 billion a year. It's, you know, we have surged all the way up and to, you know, 140,000 troops plus. That didn't work. We're now down to a tenth of that. It's sort of coming backwards. And so it's this search for what is the politically, economically, and militarily sustainable presence in the Middle East, the greater Middle East, when we also have these worries about great power conflict. And that, I think, is what you see the search for in the current administration in Washington in general.
All right. I do want to come to Afghanistan if we have time a little later. But Memduh, you're right in the middle of this. And I'd like to give a larger perspective of where really Turkey sees the situation, because out of all these countries that we've been talking about, you're the one in this arc. You're the one between the Khyber to the Bosporus, if you like. And you're supposed to be an ally of the country Richard represents, yeah. But you seem in all your public statements, Turkey certainly, to be an ally of the country Mr. Ryabkov represents. So where is Turkey today?
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. Is this working? Yeah. To the organizers, to the ministry, to my friends Sanjay, Samir. As usual, it's a great event. Now, coming to the question. We've been talking about multipolarity, and of course, last night I caught the deputy minister saying polycentricity. So it's distinct. It may be distinct. I don't know. I'm not favoring one word over the other. Just I'll use the word multipolarity loosely. It seems to me that we're entering an era of not sort of some broad-based multipolarity, but a low-cost multipolarity, in the sense that none of the great powers, be it Russia, be it US, even China, will be willing to invest troops or big bucks into the region. So that's the new setting. Now, that naturally creates a space for strategic autonomy like countries like mine. I mean, that's a given. So that's the era we are entering. But that doesn't necessarily mean a country like Turkey, with its long history, long experience, and the accumulated wisdom, will say, okay, now that there is the space for autonomy, I'll take it all. We won't. I don't think that will be the equilibrium. What will happen is, when you look at the situation, basically, if it is broken and you own it, there's a huge cost to it. So I don't think Turkey will assume the cost that the big powers will be avoiding in terms of bringing order to the region. That will never be Turkey's optimal strategy or objective. And at the same time, unlike Iran, Turkey is very much a globally integrated economy. So we are an open economy. The FDI is significant, mostly from the West, EU, and the US. So we cannot really be associated with an unstable region if we want to grow as an integrated economy in the world. So as a broad strategy, even if this new low-cost multipolarity affords Turkey the space for autonomy, strategic autonomy in the region, I think Turkey will use it very sparingly. But what we will observe, I think, in the coming years is the transition from a dominant superpower, the US, in the region, shifting gears to this low-cost multipolarity mode, and Turkey moving from a more sort of restrained regional player to one that has autonomy, room for autonomy, but doesn't want to use all of it. So it's a new balance. The equilibrium will shift, and transitions are never smooth. I think what will happen is the rhetoric on both sides will have to change, and the substantive positions will have to change. And what we've been observing in the last day or two is very much, I think, a testimony to that trend when sort of a US official makes an announcement, and that announcement is, of course, it is not sensitive to the core interests and the core values of how the Turkish public and the government sees itself. So hence the escalation and hence where we are. I think it could have been handled very differently, and substantively, the last few days would have been managed much better. So we'll see a transition, a bumpy transition, but I think we will end up at a new equilibrium.
It's interesting that you talk about this low-cost multipolarity, because presumably a decade ago, everyone spoke about intervention light. And it just does seem as if we are talking about world powers in retreat in a certain sense, except for perhaps one world power that has been discussed in other sessions. Manish Tewari, from the Indian perspective, this just looks like a nightmare building up. Because you have all these conflicts. India doesn't seem to have the stakes in the region, yet India has a lot to lose. Give me a sense of where you see the Indian perspective, because for the last 4 years, West Asia, in a sense, has been Prime Minister Modi's success story, according to many analysts. It's a part that he has visited every part of, perhaps, I think the Turkish president was here, but otherwise he's been to every part of this region, and has forged an energy diplomacy, certainly, that has ensured that India is less affected today by all these changes the gentlemen have been speaking about. But really, where do you see the cause for concern in 2019?
Well, first of all, to your question about stakes, I think we are very happy building libraries. So therefore, it's another matter as to whether somebody visits those libraries or not. But I guess that to a certain extent accounts for the fact that in all polls in certain countries, we still come out at the top. But having said that, I think it's extremely important, so actually to take a longer view if you want to contextualize the region from the Khyber to the Bosporus. And in fact, in my respectful opinion, you really need to go at least a century back to the end of the First World War. Because when the victorious Allies decided to reorder the geography of the Middle East post the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, there were decisions which were taken which had very profound implications and still continue to have implications as we speak on events as they have unfolded in the Middle East. There were agreements, pacts entered into during the course of the First World War, which then played out in a manner which possibly was not really to the best of people who live in that region. And again, from 2001 onwards till, let's say, 2013, an attempt was made to alter the geostrategic balance of the region. And at some point in time, historians are going to ask as to whether it was really worth it. Did it really achieve the objectives that it had set out to achieve? And today you have a situation whereby in Afghanistan, the United States of America, after having been there since 2001, is looking for an exit strategy. They're negotiating with the Taliban directly, trying to find a modus vivendi. And again, President Trump's announcement of a withdrawal from Syria is definitely going to create a strategic vacuum in that part of the world. So therefore, insofar as India is concerned, or let's say some of the other preeminent civilizational powers in the region are concerned, be it Iran, be it Turkey, I guess it's a cause of concern for us, because when you are going to have a very potent vacuum playing itself out in a manner which at this point in time is unpredictable, as someone who's invested, I'm talking about India, in the stability of the larger West Asian region, I think we need to watch it carefully. But as I began by saying, our contribution really has been building libraries.
Minister Ryabkov, if we can turn to the library country then, and ask really, is Russia ready for this? Is Russia ready to go back into this place that is called the empire of the graveyard of empires, where Russia itself has faced a really difficult pullout and faced a huge loss so many decades ago? The truth is, it's easy to speak about the US's pullout. The question is Russia going to fill it?
Well, several things to this. Before I do so, though, I would want to comment on what Mr. Karakullukçu said a few moments ago on particularly on the issue of multipolarity light.
Low cost.
We prefer to use the word polycentricity because we have some doubts in terms of how to measure the power of attraction, or where are the center of gravity in the evolving new world order. So something more modern, more related to networking, if you wish, between countries, changing geometries of partnerships, building up, some build coalitions of the willing, others do this in order to strengthen and underpin the fundamental pillars of international law, to create the right space where different actors play according to the well-understood firm rules. But this is a very long story. We cooperate with Turkey on so many issues, despite and irrespective of a very difficult history in our relationship. We are difficult neighbors to one another, but it doesn't in any way detract us from working proactively and constructively on different things, including in the Middle East, which is very welcome, because there is no such thing as imposition here, but everything is driven by fully and keenly understood national interest. And irrespective of how people count the number of allies or alliances that support this or that endeavor, the most important thing for any nation is firm belief in the rightness of what it is doing, and firm resolve to defend its national sovereignty and national interests. We will never be ready to start playing old games like rebuilding imperial structures. For one, this time is gone long ago. Secondly, we would never dare to offer such a perspective to any country in the world. We work exclusively on the basis of pragmatism with everyone. Who wants to do so with us, this country would be welcome. But let's remember also the good word of one of the Russian emperors that said the most reliable allies of Russia are its army and its navy. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I'm trying to take in a lot of what you've said. You said that Russia has worked basically on national interests and sovereignty is not something you would. But on Turkey, Russia has actually taken a very different position. We're not 2 years away from the downing of the jet. We're not 2 years away from the killing of the Russian envoy. And I think the trial has only just started today. Give me a sense of how much, and I don't mean just Russia and Turkey, how much these bilateral tensions, we have so many tensions across this area from the Khyber to the Bosporus, how much these bilateral tensions are eventually going to lead to further chaos in the region?
With all the tragic magnitude of these events and all the consequences they had, I don't believe they are predominant in our relationship. They have never been. We have overcome these difficulties, and there are difficult pages of history in our relationship with Iran as well. No matter, I mean, the positive agenda which is before us is by far exceeds what might be of differences and nuances. Economy, energy, cooperation on issues in regard to the Black Sea in case of Turkey, in regard to Caspian in case of Iran, natural links, south-north that should be built, infrastructure, logistics, everything, and also common cause of defending independence of each and every country to freely choose or change its security arrangements, to quote the language of OSCE that was used in a very different context some decades ago.
All right. Memduh, do you think, honestly, that obviously, as I said, everyone has welcomed a pullout in the sense that it means, A, that there's a recognition that Daesh has been at least curbed, if not completely wiped out. It also means, in a sense, that the active elements that are, at tension with each other are for the moment out. But we know how this region has been. Everybody's got a stake in somebody else's country. Iran has stakes in Lebanon and in Syria. Russia has a base there. Turkey has its Kurdish situation. Which do you think of these conflicts is going to be the next to, in fact, rise up?
Which of them will rise up?
Which do you think will be the next big threat? Because, before ISIS, there were others.
Ooh, that would be fool's errand.
And I haven't even spoken about Saudi Arabia.
It is, I mean, that would be very hard to imagine. I mean, at the moment, first of all, I think this US withdrawal, if you follow the reactions from the Turkish side, of course, there is sort of some contentment with the decision, but at the same time, it is not perceived as a clear, clean cut. There's talk of equipment support. It's not, we're assuming that we'll work on this together. And then the real focus of Turkey, and this has been true through and through, is the red line is the PKK terror and the associated PYD terror. I mean, that is what Turkey will focus on. Right. Now, whether Russians and Iranians will go ahead with that, presumably yes, because at the moment that there seems to be this, I mean, there are so many interlocking interests that even, the two sides may disagree on certain parts. Once you know that something is the ultimate priority for one party, I think we've built enough of sort of goodwill between the three parties that probably that will have to be dealt with. Because again, it's a very clear priority. This is one thing we have said from the beginning. So my guess is there will be, that will proceed, but I don't know what that will lead to in terms of new explosions and fires in the region. As I said, that's fool's errand. I wouldn't want to get into that.
Richard, Memduh just spoke about goodwill, but do you fear that the US will be accused of pulling out and letting down its allies in the conflict?
Well, certainly with respect to the Kurds, that will be the Kurdish response and the response of many who worry that for all of their flaws, the YPD and the Arab essentially army that formed up in northeastern Syria fought alongside and essentially at the behest of the United States against ISIS in a particularly meaningful way. And if we're trying to identify what the next conflict is going to look like, it seems to me that the next conflict, especially given what President Erdogan has said just in the last 24 hours, is likely to be Turkish troops against our erstwhile Kurdish allies. Now, the Kurds are going to Assad to ask for protection from the Syrian Defense Forces, so how this will all net out, I don't know. But certainly there will be some accusations of abandonment.
I want to touch a little bit about the impact of sanctions on this region, because the region, in a sense, has, one way or another, faced them. But before that, Richard, I also do want to ask that the one person who has outlived all expectation and certainly every demand from the West, not just the US, Europe as well, is Assad himself. Do you see a recognition now that Assad will remain?
Generally, yes. I think the idea of meaningfully arming the opposition to Assad is several years out of date now. Arguably, that became a fait accompli with the Russian and Iranian intervention on behalf of Assad to destroy the remaining moderate opposition to the government. And so I think generally there's a recognition that Assad is not going anywhere anytime soon. I think it remains a question about whether if the government with Assad at the top remains and the civil war ends at some point, does that mean that Assad continues forever, or is he sort of the horse that the Iranians and the Russians and others back until this is sort of gotten under control in the country, and then who knows what happens after that? But I don't see a lot of folks in Washington right now pining away for a near-term Assad transition.
So in a sense, this low-cost multipolarity and intervention light, if you like, is leading to a kind of recognition that you no longer have to push just for a regime change. Is that going to be true of Iran as well? And Manish, I want to put this question to you because in a sense, there is no country in this region who has not been in some way or the other affected by the US sanctions. The sanctions on Russia have affected India indirectly as well and directly. Turkey as well is dealing with its S-400 purchase that has led to the US canceling deals. Every part of this region is either a beneficiary when you speak about Iran's rivals, or somebody who's been hurt by sanctions themselves. And yet, we don't really see any kind of world opinion, certainly no Indian opinion, trying to actually stop sanctions from happening. Everyone's trying to figure out how to get their next waiver. But very few people are actually trying to say, hey, wait a minute, these sanctions don't work. And they haven't so far, and we're still going ahead with them. And I can see Minister Ryabkov will want to respond on sanctions. He spoke yesterday as well. But
just one word was mentioned, sanctions. I didn't speak on those.
All right. But really, do you think that there is a need for a greater understanding of how the entire region could be changed? Energy politics and energy diplomacy is changing because of it.
Well, so actually you raise a very, very interesting and a very profound question. I think a distinction has to be made between sanctions which were imposed by the United Nations and then sanctions which are being unilaterally imposed as we speak now. When it came to the sanctions by the United Nations, India adhered to that mandate, and we implemented it in totality. And yes, we've had reservations with regard to unilateral sanctions, not only because of the context of those sanctions, but because of the larger precedent which it really sets. And like every other country, we have obviously prioritized our national interest. We've tried to get a waiver. We've succeeded on 2 counts. With the S-400, we've succeeded on crude oil.
On the S-400, we don't yet know.
Yeah,
but
in the sense, and even when it comes to crude oil, we've been able to get some slack. But ultimately, the one country which has been able to endure all these sanctions, whether you like it or not, and maybe it's not the most fashionable thing to say, is Iran itself. They have, over a period of time, taken it in their stride. Yes, it has hurt them, but they've endured it. And at some point in time, I think people need to sit back and really reflect and introspect as to whether this is the right way forward. Is it producing the results which these sanctions are intended to produce, or an alternative strategy which President Barack Obama and the Europeans had put into place that would have worked out in a far more efficacious manner had it been allowed to play its entire course?
All right. Minister Ryabkov, the US does have a point. Essentially, you are dealing with countries that the US has considered its allies, has helped out in times of crisis, has held bases in. And the idea is that you are sort of fishing in troubled waters in a sense. And then the sanctions are now being used despite the fact that they came at a time when the US had a lot of backing to put those sanctions into place, particularly against Russia.
Speaking on situation in Syria once again, I think the major driver for the Russian policy towards, very intense engagement with Turkey and with Iran was a sheer recognition of the role these countries play in Syria and in relation to Syria. No more, but no less than that. And irrespective of sanctions or no sanctions, I think in the absence of progress under the UN umbrella, as we saw, the same thing would happen. It's striking for me to be present in this room and kind of listen to a debate where notions of regime change, imposition of unilateral sanctions are being, kicked around as something very generally acceptable, very normal, very usual, very standard. And the chances for yet another regime change are being discussed by think tankers, politicians in a very sober, quiet, and cold manner. Something is wrong in the mindset of people today, but let me limit my comments to this.
All right, I take your point, but I think the general sense is that these are no longer acceptable rather than what you're saying. Okay, I want to go very quickly round. Memduh wants to jump
one
in.
point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, the withdrawing from the JCPOA, these secondary sanctions, I mean, they're not acceptable. But the unilateral sanctions that these countries apply, they're an alternative to something else, something probably worse. And in the jet crisis we had with Russia, there was the Russian sanctions on Turkey. So we, countries do this. But it is, as long as it's, it's as I said, it's a way of showing, it's part of the foreign policy arsenal. As long as it's not secondary sanctions and you don't leverage other assets, I think we'll have to live with it at least for some time.
Well, now I'm not a lawyer. This is my disclaimer. But doing, to some extent, elements of the Russian foreign policy, I took time to look into the doctrine. And the doctrine, at least, which is being taught at the schools in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and elsewhere, says that unilateral sanctions are only admissible in cases of adversary action of a state against another one, which is now contemplating these unilateral sanctions in return. So in particular case of downing of the Russian plane and pilot, I think the legal base, I'm not speaking emotions here, but I think the legal base was completely in order according to the doctrine which we've been taught and which we follow. In all other cases, especially in case of one country that according to our account imposed sanctions over the years upon entities and citizens of more than 70 states around, I have a difficult time to see how these 70-plus states went into any adversary action against that nation.
All right, one man's... You wanted to say something?
Well, First of all, I think the idea that unilateral sanctions don't work, or that only sanctions that have gone through the UN Security Council work, has been disproved by the agreement of the JCPOA in the first place. Had the parties to the JCPOA only relied on UN Security Council sanctions, it's not clear to me at all that Iran would have come to the negotiating table. Now, the Iranians have always said, well, the sanctions had nothing to do with it. It just happened to be a coincidence of time that after the application of sanctions, we decided to come and negotiate with you. But that doesn't really stand up to critical evaluation. And then, you know, the idea that a nation doesn't have the right to trade and do financial interaction with the countries of its choice, that somehow you're obligated by international law not to sanction countries. First, I don't know that that's accepted by even Russia, which, you know, has applied sanctions of its own over the years. But, you know, what is the alternative? That we could, countries such as the United States, in response to, you know, the disruption of the presidential election by a foreign entity, could do nothing. It could go to war, or it could put sanctions. So what is the most reasonable outcome there? I think that if we just have a discussion trying to knock down the idea that countries should not use their economic power, but only their military and diplomatic instruments, we won't get very far.
All right. Before I come to the question, I want all of you to answer. Could I just see who would like to ask questions, and then we can get back to our, I don't see, oh, there is a hand up there. Anyone else who'd like to ask a question? Why don't you go ahead, sir, and then you. Wait, the gentleman behind you, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. This is Xiong Liang from Beijing, China. My question goes to three of our panelists from Russia, Turkey, and United States. So how do you evaluate the hesitation of Trump administration on the pull-out of United States troops from Syria? And how will this affect on the Astana process? Thank you.
And the gentleman just ahead who had a question.
Thank you. I have a question for Russian representative and the probably Turkish representative. I think the biggest event in the Middle East in the coming years will be the restoration of Syria. As the terrorist threat is almost gone, now there's time to restore it. As we have a panel on Iran and Turkey, can you please discuss the issue? Is there a possible future that would be beneficial both for Iran, Russia, and Turkey for Syria? Can it be rebuilt in the way that there is no need to destroy it again in the future? Thank you.
All right, and the gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Varun Sharma. I'm a policy and legal consultant. Historically, US has chosen to deal with some difficult situations in West Asia by dealing with some non-state actors, whether it's Afghanistan against Soviets or now with Assad ISIS. Are there lessons to be learned here for Turkey and India, specifically dealing with the US pullout?
All right, on non-state actors as well, and I'll go around the panel in case you have any thoughts on this. But Memduh, if I could just start with you, it's interesting that that question came up about Turkey and Iran, because today is actually an interesting day. Turkey has just restarted its oil imports from Iran. And at the same time, what we are seeing is a situation where Russia and Turkey are, trying to sort of meet as well. And then we have this conversation between the Turkish president and the US president. So if you want to just take the question the gentleman had, which was about the fact that Turkey and Iran eventually are going to be some kind of they are going to be the ballast or whatever in the middle of it.
To be honest, when I first got the invitation to this panel, I was somewhat taken aback because we rarely think of Iran and Turkey in the same basket. So I thought about that. How did this happen? And then from the sort of far away from the Indian perspective, I thought, well, maybe there is that continuity, the lines, the trade lines, the energy lines that sort of puts it together. Now, these are obviously two old nations. We are not ancient. I think the Iranians have the right to be called ancient. They've been around. We've been in Anatolia for about 1,000 years, so we don't go that far. But nevertheless, we've been around. And the thing is, we have lived probably about 400 years, almost 400 years, without changing the borders. So Iran and Turkey have had tensions, have been, sort of vying for power with the Safavids and the Ottomans. So this has been going on for some time. We have matured in how we deal with each other. We do not sit eye to eye on many issues, but we know that as two sort of old powers, there are ways of managing these things. So in the Syrian case, what is an outcome that will be agreeable to both sides? It's hard to predict. I mean, if indeed, because everybody agrees on this very sort of meta ideal of a democratically elected Syrian government, and so that sounds very good. If somehow we get to that political solution, if it turns out to be Assad, I don't know how that will fare in the medium term, because it's unlikely that Assad will actually behave in a constructive way in the region. So it will probably lead to tensions down the road. So in that sense, I just hope that a democratically elected government does not end up being an Assad government. If that doesn't happen, I mean, to me, it looks like the Iranians are more concerned about having the Hezbollah structures and the like in Syria. Maybe they'll compromise on Assad, I don't know. And of course, if the Hezbollah link continues, then the Israelis will be upset and they will try to interfere. So I don't think there is an equilibrium that I can see at the moment. But I do not believe the Turkish-Iranian tension will be the deal breaker in reaching the final solution in Syria. We have lived for just too long together. We know our way. We know ways to deal with these tensions.
All right, Minister Ryabkov.
Yes, thank you. First to the question which was asked on our assessment of the US pullout from Syria. We follow the developments with interest. We do believe that the outcome is hardly predictable yet. As ever, on all issues in relation to Russia's interests or to the US-Russian relations, we judge and conclude upon actions and not statements. There is no such thing as confidence or trust between Moscow and Washington these days. So we need to see it in action before we come to any qualified conclusion. When it happens, if it all happens, what it would mean, and so on and so forth. On restoration of Syria, yes, this is something that urgently needs to be started. Russia undertakes significant efforts through its military presence, engineer corps and other forces, but also civilian constructors in the areas that are free from terrorists. We undertook a major effort to defeat ISIS, Daesh there. We went there in support of the government in its fight against terrorists. And Russia does have a record that can be easily accessed. For example, at the Foreign Ministry website, of contacts, interaction with different groupings of moderate and not so moderate opposition that visited, to whom we had contacts, to whom we conclude documents, to whom we engage on a daily basis, and we intend to continue. The only purpose of the Russian presence was, as I said, to help the legitimate government in Damascus to be free this country from its country, from terrorists, and close the terrorist enclaves. One word on what was said earlier by Mr. Fontaine. I understand that many in the US strongly believe in Russia's wrongdoing in regard to election meddling, hacking, whatever. We have offered countless times to this administration and also a dozen of times to the Obama administration to do it in a very pragmatic manner, to go through the interagency process, to deal with IP addresses, with individuals, with institutions. The answer is no, or alternatively, there is no answer. likewise, because there is no such thing as trust between Moscow and Washington, we cannot just take as something granted what we hear from Washington on these issues. And like Mueller's investigation, we haven't seen anything during these 2 years that underpin claims of the US officials that Russia is quote unquote guilty. So this is it. And against that background, to multiply sanctions, I think this is a sign of weakness of the US policy.
All right, subject of another panel anyway. But Richard Fontaine, there was something Minister Ryabkov said over there, that they're watching the developments, but they don't know what this means. And the truth is, if we just go by Mr. Trump's tweets, it went from pull out to, pull out in a very orderly and thoughtful way. Do you see, I mean, even Afghanistan has now been slowed down, but do you see the Syrian pullout happening imminently?
One never knows precisely these days exactly what's going to happen when it comes to administration policy on some of these things. And it depends on what your definition of imminent is. So the short answer is, I don't know exactly what this will look like over time. I think what Mr. Bolton was trying to do, I think, was absolutely the right thing, which is try to get guarantees that there wouldn't be attack on our erstwhile Kurdish allies, among other things. That's much harder to do when you've already made the decision to withdraw than before you've made the decision to withdraw, but he's trying. But we saw in the last 24 hours how this was received. I think one of the biggest issues is going to be the regrowth of ISIS. It is not true that 99% of ISIS is destroyed. 99% of the territory ISIS held has been reclaimed, and there's one pocket with a couple thousand ISIS fighters in the kind of hinterlands between Syria and Iraq. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated in Iraq, and it came back as ISIS and formed the biggest terrorist sanctuary in human history. Many of these ISIS guys have been taken off the battlefield, but there's others who are in urban areas or they've gone to ground. And unless that area is stabilized and there's a permanent security presence, we will see this come back as a terrorist sanctuary, and ISIS or son of ISIS or grandson of ISIS will be back, and it will be planning attacks against all of our countries. And that is, I think, an extremely unresolved thing right now. I don't think that the United States saying, well, let the locals kind of deal with it is likely to be enough, because when we tried this before, we had to come in and lead the coalition against them.
So there is always that possibility. And final word to you, Manish, this is not a question just about the Middle East, but it is typified by the way everyone has dealt with it. Each of the gentlemen on the panel represents a country who is led by what is called a strong man. The strong man idea just means that today, no matter what the situation is, it can be changed on a phone call or on a Twitter exchange or in some kind of public manner, if you like. Minister Ryabkov spoke about the Sochi dialogue for Syria, but we also know Sochi because it saw a kind of rapprochement between the two leaders of India and Russia as well. So my question is, how much of 2019, and particularly either the worsening of conflicts or the resolving of them, will be determined in a sense not by well thought out ideas and taken in think tanks or taken by ministries, but will just be about these strong men either talking to each other or fighting with each other?
Well, Suhashini, it doesn't lie to my remit to really be commenting on what other democracies do. I think every democracy has a certain logic and a certain dynamic, and it would be completely remiss on my part to be commenting on the internal political processes of any country. Having said that, in India we are heading into an election. I think in the next 90 days or so, we would be in full election mode. Not that we are not in full election mode 365 days a year, every single day, but that's a different thing altogether. And 2019 may have a different dynamic in India. But to your larger question as to whether personality-led interventions can find rational solutions I would like to disagree. And I think that there is a great role for both institutional engagement, institutional knowledge, and to move forward in a structured and in an orderly manner rather than doing things on an impulse or doing things on a hop, and eventually it does not get you the desired results. So you may have people who are able to personality drive their governments. Well, that's their prerogative, but when it comes to international relations or intergovernmental relations, I think institutions and processes do have a very important role to play.
All right, and my final question, which I want to go through the whole panel with, is a year from now, Raisina Dialogue 2020. Will that situation in the Middle East, but particularly in Syria, be better or worse?
Well, let me be very frank in what I think would be the case. It would be more or less the same, with a slight tracking towards political solution. We will work hard together with other guarantor states to bring this moment closer to happen. But the burden is so heavy, we will do our utmost to overcome it.
All right, Manish?
Well, we can only hope that it gets better, because I think there is a need for the region to stabilize. And Syria possibly represents the largest black hole in that process of stabilization. So we do hope that when we meet again in 2020 at Raisina, we'll have something more optimistic to look forward to.
Memduh?
Of course, again, hard to tell, but it seems like the baseline of expectations and demands has really shifted among the players. So presumably with lower expectations and lower demands, we should be closer to an end game. The only exception is Assad. I think his expectations may have been heightened by the recent developments. So I'm hoping that if in the next coming months, 6 months, 9 months, his expectations and demands can be recalibrated downwards with the help of our Russian and Iranian friends, I think we might just have some sort of, we might be converging to a deal by this time next year.
You're
but
all
that's
sounding
the
much
condition.
more hopeful.
That's the condition, but unfortunately, I'm not encouraged by the deputy minister's rather, sort of skeptical tone.
All right, Richard?
I think you may be closer to an end of the Civil War. I think that you'll see a diminution of American influence, an increase in Iranian and Russian influence. Assad, another sort of lifeline indefinitely, and potentially the resurgence of ISIS, although obviously I hope not. And whether you characterize that bundle of things as good or bad, I suppose depends on where you sit.
On that slightly more hopeful note than one had expected, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for staying with us, and a round of applause for the panel.